What if I told you that the very dream your parents crushed could become the lifeline that saves them? My name is Sage, and this is the story of how I went from hiding my art like a guilty secret to using my paintings to pay for my parents' medical bills. If you've ever been told your passion isn't practical, you need to hear this. Subscribe now because what happens next will change everything you think you know about following your dreams. I still remember the way my father's jaw tightened when he found my sketchbook hidden beneath my calculus textbook. It was a cold February evening in our modest home in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. The snow was falling steadily outside our kitchen window, and I could hear my mother washing dishes in the background, the familiar clinking of plates creating a rhythm I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "What is this, Sage?" Dad's voice carried that tone I'd learned to fear. Disappointment mixed with barely contained frustration. He held up my sketch of the old oak tree in our backyard, the one I'd spent hours perfecting during what was supposed to be my advanced mathematics study time. I felt my cheeks burn as I watched him flip through page after page of my secret world. Portraits of classmates, landscapes of our neighborhood, abstract designs that came to me in dreams. Each drawing represented hours of stolen time, moments when I let my soul breathe through pencil strokes and shading. "It's just a hobby, Dad," I whispered, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Art wasn't just a hobby for me. It was oxygen. My mother appeared in the doorway, her hands still damp from the dishwater. Margaret Collins had always been the gentler of my parents, but when it came to my future, she stood firmly beside my father. "Sage, sweetheart, we've talked about this before. You're going to be a doctor, remember? Like Dr. Peterson down the street. Stable income, respect in the community." The weight of their expectations felt like a boulder on my chest. I was 17, a senior at Lincoln High School, and my parents had my entire life mapped out. Pre-med at Case Western Reserve University, medical school, residency, and then a comfortable practice in Cleveland. It was a good plan, a safe plan, a plan that would make them proud. But it wasn't my plan. "I know you think I'm good at biology," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I'm not passionate about it. Not like this." I gestured toward my sketchbook, which my father still held like evidence of some terrible crime. Dad closed the book with a sharp snap. "Passion doesn't pay bills, Sage. Passion doesn't put food on the table or keep a roof over your head. You think your artistic passion is going to take care of us when we're old and need help?" His words stung because I knew they came from a place of love, twisted though it was. My parents had immigrated to the United States from Ireland when I was 5 years old. They'd worked multiple jobs, sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. Dad worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local hospital, and Mom cleaned offices downtown. They'd saved every penny to ensure I could attend college without the burden of crushing debt. How could I tell them that their sacrifice was pushing me toward a life that would slowly kill my spirit? "Art is not a career. It's a delusion," Mom said softly, but her words cut deeper than any shout. "We've seen what happens to people who chase dreams instead of building futures. Mrs. Murphy's son, the one who went to New York to be an actor? He's 35 and still waiting tables." I wanted to argue, to tell them about successful artists, about galleries and exhibitions, about the growing digital art market. But I was 17, and their certainty felt insurmountable. They had statistics, examples, and the weight of practical experience on their side. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my sketchbook confiscated and hidden somewhere in my parents' bedroom. The silence felt different now, heavy with the weight of a dream being slowly strangled. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in a pristine white blanket that would inevitably melt and reveal the brown grass beneath. I made a decision that night, one that would haunt me for years to come. I would be the dutiful daughter. I would study medicine, make my parents proud, and bury my artistic dreams so deep that maybe, eventually, they would stop hurting. But dreams, I would learn, have a way of refusing to stay buried. 4 years later, I stood in the anatomy lab at Case Western Reserve University, my hands steady as I carefully dissected a cadaver's cardiovascular system. The The smell of formaldehyde had become as familiar as coffee, and I could identify every bone, muscle, and organ with the precision my professors demanded. I was a good student, not brilliant, but consistently competent. My grades were solid, my attendance perfect, and my professors wrote letters of recommendation that praised my dedication and reliability. On paper, I was exactly what my parents had envisioned, a future doctor who would make them proud. But inside, I felt like I was slowly disappearing. My apartment near campus was sparse, functional. Medical textbooks lined the shelves where art books should have been. The walls were bare except for a few motivational posters about the human body that I'd put up to convince myself I was passionate about what I was studying. I told myself the emptiness was temporary, that once I graduated and started residency, I'd feel the fulfillment everyone promised would come. The only art in my life existed in stolen moments. I'd sketch on napkins during lunch breaks, doodle in the margins of my notes when professors weren't looking, and sometimes, late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd draw on the back of old assignments. These fragments of creativity were like breadcrumbs leading back to who I really was, but I was too afraid to follow the trail. My relationship with my parents had settled into a comfortable routine of mutual satisfaction. They called twice a week, always asking about my classes, my grades, my future plans. They'd beam with pride when I told them about my acceptance to medical school, about the internship I'd secured at Cleveland Clinic. Dad would tell his coworkers about his daughter, the future doctor, and Mom would mention me to her church friends with a tone of quiet triumph. I was their success story, their American dream made manifest. But success, I discovered, could feel remarkably like failure when it wasn't truly yours. During my third year of medical school, something shifted. I was working with a patient named Eleanor, an elderly woman who'd been brought in after a mild heart attack. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and eyes that held decades of stories. While reviewing her chart, I noticed she'd listed her occupation as artist, something that immediately caught my attention. "You're an artist?" I asked during one of my routine checks. Her face lit up despite the hospital gown and the IV in her arm. "I was a painter. Still am, I suppose, though my hands shake a bit more these days." She gestured to a small sketch pad on her bedside table. "I can't help myself. Even in here, I see things worth capturing." I found myself visiting Eleanor more often than necessary, drawn to her stories about art shows, gallery openings, and the life she'd built around her creativity. She'd studied at the Cleveland Institute of Art, had shown her work in galleries across Ohio, and had supported herself through her art for over 40 years. "But weren't you afraid?" I asked one evening as she showed me sketches she'd made of other patients. "Afraid of not making enough money? Of not being stable?" Eleanor laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, honey, I was terrified. But you know what I was more afraid of? Living a life that wasn't mine. I watched my sister become a banker because it was safe, and she spent 30 years counting other people's money while her own dreams withered away." Her words followed me home that night, echoing in my empty apartment. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, staring at a face that looked increasingly unfamiliar. When had I stopped recognizing myself? That weekend, I drove to an art supply store for the first time in years. I told myself I was just looking, just remembering. But I left with a small set of watercolors, a few brushes, and a pad of paper. I hid them in my closet like contraband. The first painting I created was terrible. Years of suppressed creativity pouring out in clumsy strokes and muddy colors. But as I worked, something inside me began to breathe again. The cramped feeling in my chest, the sensation of living in a space too small for my soul, began to ease. I painted every weekend for the next 6 months, hidden away in my apartment, terrified that someone would discover my secret. But with each canvas, I felt more like myself. The paintings improved, my technique returned, and slowly, I began to remember who I was beneath the white coat and stethoscope. The turning point came during my final year of medical school. I was exhausted, running on coffee and determination, when I received a call that would change everything. "Sage," my mother's voice was shaking. "Your father's in the hospital. He's had a stroke." The drive to Cleveland felt endless. Every mile weighted with fear and guilt. I'd been so focused on my studies, on becoming the daughter they wanted, that I'd barely noticed the signs. Dad's increasing fatigue, the way he'd started struggling to remember simple things, the slight slur in his speech that we'd all attributed to his Irish accent becoming more pronounced with age. I found him in the ICU, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The man who'd worked 2 jobs to put me through school, who'd never missed a day of work in his life, was connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. Mom sat beside his bed, her hand wrapped around his, her face etched with worry lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. "The doctors say he'll recover," she whispered when I entered the room. "But it's going to be a long road. Physical therapy, speech therapy, possibly occupational therapy. The insurance will cover some of it, but—" She didn't need to finish. I understood. Medical bills, even with insurance, could be devastating. The comfortable middle-class life my parents had built could crumble under the weight of prolonged medical care. Over the next several weeks, I split my time between my final medical school rotations and the hospital where Dad was recovering. I watched him struggle to form words, saw the frustration in his eyes when his body wouldn't cooperate with his mind. The strong, determined man who'd shaped my entire life was learning to walk again, to speak clearly, to perform tasks that had once been as natural as breathing. During one of these visits, I was sketching in the corner of his room, a habit I'd developed to manage my anxiety. The drawing was of Dad sleeping, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been while awake. I was so absorbed in capturing the way the afternoon light fell across his features that I didn't notice him watching me. "You're drawing again," he said, his words still slightly slurred but clearer than they'd been in days. I looked up, startled, and realized I'd been caught. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know you don't approve, but it helps me think." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Show me," he said finally. With trembling hands, I turned the sketch pad toward him. It wasn't just the drawing of him sleeping. I'd filled several pages with scenes from the hospital, portraits of nurses, abstract expressions of worry and hope. Years of suppressed creativity had found their way onto paper. Dad studied each page carefully, his eyes moving across the lines and shading with a focus I'd rarely seen him apply to anything except his work. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "These are good, Sage," he said quietly. "Really good." I felt tears spring to my eyes. "Dad, I was wrong," he interrupted, his voice stronger now. "I was scared, and I let my fear make decisions for you. But lying here, watching you draw, I can see something in your face that I've never seen when you talk about medicine." Mom, who had been quietly listening from the other side of the room, walked over to look at the sketches. I watched her face as she took in my work, expecting disapproval or disappointment. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen before. Recognition. "You have a gift," she said softly. "I always knew you had a gift, but I thought gifts weren't practical. I thought they were luxuries we couldn't afford." The 3 of us sat in silence for a while, the weight of years of suppressed dreams hanging in the air between us. Finally, Dad spoke again. "What do you want to do, Sage? Not what we want, not what's practical or safe. What do you want?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question in years. The answer came immediately, rising from a place so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. "I want to paint," I said. "I want to create things that matter, that make people feel something. I want to tell stories with color and light and texture." Dad nodded slowly. "Then that's what you should do. But medical school, the debt, everything you've sacrificed." "The debt will be there regardless," Mom said practically. "But life is short, sweetheart. Too short to spend it living someone else's dream." That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my acceptance letter to the residency program at Cleveland Clinic. It represented everything my parents had wanted for me, everything I'd worked toward for years. It was security, stability, and respect. It was also a prison. I thought about Eleanor, the artist I'd met during my rotations, who'd told me that the only thing worse than failing at your dreams was succeeding at someone else's. I thought about my father, lying in that hospital bed, realizing that time was more precious than security. I thought about my mother, who'd spent years cleaning other people's offices so I could have opportunities she'd never had. And I thought about who I was when I held a paintbrush instead of a stethoscope. The next morning, I withdrew from the residency program and enrolled in the Cleveland Institute of Art. The first year as an art student at 25 was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. I was surrounded by younger students who'd been honing their craft for years while I'd been studying the Krebs cycle and memorizing drug interactions. My technique was rusty, my knowledge of art history embarrassingly limited, and my confidence as fragile as wet watercolor paper. But I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. Professor Martinez, who taught my advanced painting class, was a woman in her 50s with paint-stained fingers and an intensity that reminded me of my father before his stroke. She was direct, sometimes brutally honest, but I could see she recognized something in my work that even I wasn't sure about yet. "You paint like someone who's been starved," she told me after critiquing one of my early pieces, a landscape of Lake Erie that I'd worked on for weeks. "There's a hunger in your brushstrokes, an urgency. Don't lose that." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I threw myself into my studies with the same dedication I'd once applied to medical school. The difference was that now, every assignment felt like a gift, rather than a burden. Color theory, composition, art history. Subjects that had once seemed frivolous now felt essential to my very existence. My parents' medical bills continued to mount during this time. Dad's recovery was progressing, but slowly. He'd returned to work part-time, but his reduced salary combined with the ongoing therapy costs created a financial strain that kept me awake at night. I took on part-time work wherever I could find it, waitressing at a downtown restaurant, cleaning studios at the art school, even helping with inventory at a local gallery. It was at that gallery, Griffin Contemporary, where I met Marcus Chen, the owner. Marcus was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd built his reputation by discovering emerging artists and helping them develop their careers. He noticed me working late one evening, cleaning the space after a particularly crowded opening. "You're the art student, aren't you?" he asked, startling me as I was carefully wiping down a display case. "Yes, sir. At the Institute." He studied me for a moment. "What's your medium?" "Painting, mostly. Oil and watercolor." "Would you be interested in showing me some of your work?" I almost laughed. "I don't think I'm ready for that, Mr. Chen. I'm still learning." "We're all still learning," he said gently. "But sometimes the best art comes from students who aren't yet constrained by what they think they can't do." A week later, I nervously carried a small portfolio to his office. The paintings I'd chosen represented the best of my work over the past year, a series exploring the intersection of medical imagery and natural forms, inspired by my time in both worlds. Hearts that bloomed like flowers, veins that branched like rivers, bones that curved like tree branches. Marcus studied each piece in silence, occasionally making small sounds of interest or approval. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "These are remarkable," he said finally. "There's a sophistication here that I don't usually see in student work. You're telling a story about healing, about the connection between the clinical and the organic." I felt my face flush. I was trying to process my transition from medicine to art. "It shows. In the best way." He paused, seeming to consider something. "I'd like to include 2 of these in our Emerging Artists Showcase next month, if you're interested." My first exhibition was a revelation. Standing in the gallery, watching people respond to my work, seeing them pause and really look at what I'd created. It was a high unlike anything I'd experienced. An older woman stood in front of my painting Cardiac Garden for nearly 10 minutes, tears streaming down her face. When she finally moved on, she found me and explained that she'd recently undergone heart surgery and had been struggling with the vulnerability of her recovery. "Your painting," she said. "It shows that our bodies aren't just broken machines to be fixed. They're living things that can grow and bloom again." That night, I called my parents to tell them about the exhibition. Dad's voice was stronger now, his words clearer. though he still struggled with complex sentences. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not because you're successful, but because you're brave." The sales from that first exhibition were modest, but they were enough to cover Dad's physical therapy for 2 months. More importantly, they proved that my art could do more than just express my feelings. It could actually help my family. Over the next 2 years, my work evolved and my reputation grew. Marcus became not just a gallery owner, but a mentor, teaching me about the business side of art, helping me understand pricing, networking, and the importance of building relationships with collectors. My paintings began to sell regularly, and I started receiving commissions. The breakthrough came during my final year at the Institute. I'd been working on a series called Healing Hands, large-scale paintings that combined medical imagery with elements of hope and renewal. The series had been inspired by watching my father's recovery, but it spoke to a universal experience of healing and resilience. A collector from New York saw the series during a visit to Cleveland and offered to purchase all 6 paintings for more than I'd made in my entire first year as an artist. More importantly, she wanted to introduce my work to galleries in New York and Los Angeles. "Your parents must be so proud," she said as we finalized the sale. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the years of suppressed dreams, the fear and guilt, the courage it had taken to change course. But mostly, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Dad just that morning. He'd been looking at the medical bills that still arrived regularly, the ongoing costs of his care, the financial reality of aging with health issues. His face had carried the weight of worry I'd seen so many times throughout my childhood. "Don't worry about it, Dad," I told him. "I've got this covered." He'd looked at me with confusion. "Sage, you're still a student. You can't—" "Actually, I can." I'd shown him the check from the New York collector, watching his eyes widen as he processed the amount. "My art is paying for your healthcare now." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The career they'd forbidden me from pursuing was now providing the financial security they'd always worried about. But more than that, it was giving me a life filled with purpose and joy. Standing in my studio now, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion, I can see the full arc of my journey. The girl who hid her sketchbook beneath her textbooks has become a woman whose paintings hang in galleries across the country. The daughter who once chose duty over dreams has found a way to honor both. My parents visit my studio regularly now. Dad, whose speech has improved dramatically, loves to tell visitors about his daughter, the artist. Mom keeps a portfolio of my work in her purse, ready to show anyone who'll look. They've become my biggest supporters, attending every exhibition, sharing my successes with anyone who'll listen. But the greatest success isn't measured in sales or recognition. It's measured in the way I feel when I wake up each morning, eager to see what will emerge on the canvas that day. It's in the letters I receive from people who've been moved by my work, who found comfort or inspiration in the colors and forms I've created. It's in the knowledge that I'm living a life that's truly mine, one brushstroke at a time. The paintings that now pay for my parents' health care are more than just financial support. They're proof that dreams deferred aren't always dreams denied. Sometimes they're just dreams waiting for the right moment to bloom. And sometimes, the most practical thing you can do is follow your heart.